I'm Ashy and I'm continuing my monochromatic series. So the color I'm using is actually a mix of sap green, cobalt blue, and Payne's gray because I wanted like a mossy blue-green, but I didn't have that as a convenience color in my palette. So I'm just mixing it up, but I'm painting the whole series in that same mix. Let me know what you think would be a cool color to use for monochromatic paintings in the comments. So I did start by wetting up the entire page really generously with clean water. And then I'm just dropping in a really watery mix of my color into the page, starting at the top left. And then I just tilt my page so that the paint streaks kind of in a diagonal from the top left to the bottom of right of the page. And that really just creates a lot of interest and movement in the sky of the painting. So I added in my first really watery mix, tilted it, and let it bleed, and then added in yet like another layer while it was still wet. Now, I do use a heat tool throughout this painting between each layer so that I don't have to wait for each layer to dry. This painting took about 60 minutes to complete in total, but it would have taken way longer than that without the heat tool. And I'm also super impatient, so I have a really hard time actually waiting. So using that heat ensures that I'm really able to build up the depth with wet on wet layers and not just continue to like move around and lift paint from the previous layers, which sometimes if you're painting while it's still wet and trying to build up, it just lifts the previous layers. Now I am using Baohong or Baohong, I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it, 100% cotton cold pressed paper, and it really performs wonderfully with this level of water. It reacts really well to wet on wet. It also reacts great to wet on dry, splatters, glazing, pretty much everything, dry brushing. The texture is awesome. So I really like this paper, and it's decent on the budget as well. So at this point, I'm just continuing to build up more layers here. So I painted in kind of a gently sloping hill, and I'm just building up layers, keeping it darkest at the top left of the hill, and then letting it blend and like fade out like an ombre effect almost down toward the bottom of the page. And so doing that just creates a lot of contrast between the sky and the hill. Now, after building up just a little bit of depth, I decided that I wanted it to be a slightly deeper color. So I'm glazing here. So I'm just using a thin watery mix just to build up a little bit more layer or a little bit more depth. But I add a little bit of water to my brush for each stroke as I'm moving from left to right across the page so that I'm still maintaining that darker on the left, lighter on the right. Then while that glaze is still wet, I do go back in the sky a little bit and do that diagonal bleeding again. I also lift a little bit from right above the hill so that there's a lot of contrast between the sky and the hill. So I just want to kind of ensure that isn't getting too dark right on the border because I want that to be my highest contrast point. So basically, I just keep adding more and more layers into the hill. The sky's pretty well done here, but the hill, I wanted it to be an even stronger contrast here. So I'm really focusing on building up the darkest points at the top of the hill and then creating movement with almost like a little S curve going down the hill so that it creates a sense of depth and kind of undulation in the ground. So instead of just being a hill sloping off the side of the page, it kind of dips down and then flattens back out. And doing that little S curve gives it that impression. It also helps to create a really strong focal point using value contrast. So value contrast, where you have the lightest values next to the darkest values, that's going to typically be where your eyes are drawn into the painting, especially in a monochromatic painting where you don't have any color contrast. That value contrast is really important. So having the darkest values next to basically the lightest values on kind of the highest point of the hill there on the left really draws your eye there. Also, creating all of the diagonals that kind of point to that spot also draws the eye there. And so even without adding the tree, which will be a very obvious focal point. Even without adding that tree, your eye is pretty much drawn to that high spot on the left side of the hill. So using diagonals, contrast, and then even, having that be the high point really solidifies that focal point. So you can see I'm really just adding more and more depth to that same spot. That's why I said that's really the point of this almost the whole painting is creating that contrast there. I do add some splatters into the hill just to get some texture, drop in a little bit of clean water, and that just creates some intentional backruns and just a little bit more texture into the hill. I also add like a grassy texture to the foreground, and that just helps to create a little bit more sense of depth. I also keep building up the darkness there. It's not as dark as my darkest point, but having a little bit of darkness at the bottom of the page helps to kind of ground the painting a little bit. And also, I'm using the dry brushing texture here. I mentioned that dry brushing works really well on this paper. And so that's a really easy way to build up this texture without having to paint each individual blade of grass, basically. The diagonal of the grass here also contrasts nicely because it's going the opposite direction, basically, as all the other diagonals in the painting. So it just adds a little bit more interest into the painting by having that going the opposite direction. So then I just add another really light layer to the hill itself, really focusing on that subtle S-shaped curve, just to give it that little bit more detail to pull that slope out. By adding some slightly more defined directional lines, it makes it a little bit more obvious. So again, I just wanted that grassy area to be a little bit darker, so I add another layer and pull some of those grasses up just to make it a little bit darker again. Once I'm generally happy with the painting, I then go in and add my main focal point of the tree. So I hit not quite the high point on the hill, but really close. And it's just off center, basically. So it's a nice spot for the focal point without being dead center. I probably could have made it either a little bit higher or a little bit lower on the page because it is close to the center of the page, but I'm still really happy with it. I think it balances nicely, even though it is kind of in the middle of the page. It's still a nice spot for the focal point. Now for the painting of the tree itself, I try to give it a lot of really interesting branch shapes and make sure that my trunk is the thickest, and then I get thinner as I move farther up and out from the main trunk. And that helps to create a bit of realism to the tree. I also try to make sure that it's not too symmetrical with branches just shooting off right and left from the same spot on the tree. Trees don't typically grow like that. They're a lot more random. So I'm really trying to keep it nice and random and not too symmetrical. Once I get the tree painted in, I add just a couple birds into the sky, making sure to alter the value and the size to make it look like the darkest, biggest bird is the closest to the tree, and then the lightest, smallest bird is the farthest away. And these are really just little M shapes and V shapes with kind of a dot in the middle to indicate the tiny little head. So these don't have to be really detailed, obviously. And there it is. So then I just sign it and it's all done. So I really feel like this one is actually very dramatic for how simple of a scene it is. I really hope you enjoyed this and I hope you learned something. I would love to hear any feedback or questions from you, so head down into the comments for those and have an awesome day.